Nowadays, when people talk about the 6th generation of Pokemon, you'll almost always hear one thing: lost potential. If all these hour-long video essays about the downfall of Pokemon are to be believed, Pokemon X and Y were the turning point when Game Freak started to get lazy and their games became shallow, unfinished, uninspired messes. But I don't know, I think they're alright. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I love Generation 6. I love the Kalos region, I love some of the new Pokemon, the music is some of the best in the series. But, I have to admit, they do sort of have a point. You can't deny that this generation's region and Pokedex are a bit sparse when compared to the previous 5 games. Now, don't get me wrong, I totally understand why this is the case. This was the first game on a new system, it was the first game in 3D, the devs had to learn and develop a completely new workflow. This game was always gonna walk so that others could run. But, what if it didn't have to be that way? What if Game Freak were given just a little more time to polish these games off? What if they were able to add in just a few more things to make these feel like complete games instead of a mere promise of things to come? Or, maybe you're a ROM hacker or something looking to make an absolutely sick Pokemon Z. That'd be cool too. Today, I am beginning this journey to uncover all that this game could have been as I mathematically fix Kalos' Pokedex. Richard, hit that intro. A huge thanks to all my supporters on Patreon for voting on this video topic. More information on how you can support this channel in the description down below. So, why do I say that the Kalos Pokedex needs to be fixed? Well, there are 2 reasons. The first generation of Pokemon famously introduced 151 new Pokemon, giving you loads of options to choose from to craft your own unique team. Generation 2 was a bit smaller, only adding 100 new Pokemon, but, it was on way more limited hardware, and they also added all of Kanto. I think they did alright. Generation 3 introduced another 135, and Generation 4 is actually surprisingly small, introducing only 107 new Pokemon, many of which were evolutions to older Pokemon as opposed to brand new lines. But thankfully, Generation 5 more than made up for this with the biggest regional dex yet, introducing 156 new Pokemon. So, we have a trend of new games introducing an average of 130 new Pokemon per game. And then we get to Kalos that introduced 72. That's it. True, if you include Mega Evolutions, that number jumps up to 100, exactly the same as Johto, but those are only temporary forms, and you can't include more than one on your team, so it's not quite the same as a brand new Pokemon. And even if you do include them, at best, X and Y are still tied for the smallest dex in the series up to that point. But that's not the only issue. If you look at the data, this Pokedex is incredibly unbalanced in terms of types. Here's a list of how many new Pokemon of each type were introduced in Generation 6, not including Mega Evolutions. This dex is absolutely stuffed with Fairy types, which makes sense. They were the brand new type at the time, you want a lot to pick from. But if you wanted to grab a new Poison type to combat these fairies, hope you like Dragalge. These 2 issues combined means that it's very challenging to build a team that has a distinctly Kalos identity. More than likely, you're going to end up using some older generation Pokemon that you may have already used before because, well, there's not really any other good options. And I think this is a big reason why some people feel like these games are shallow. Luckily though, this data has not only illuminated the problem, it also lays out a clear path to a solution. And that is science, baby. If the average Pokedex contains around 130 new Pokemon, all we need to do is make around 30 new Pokemon that primarily have these underrepresented types, and we're back in business, baby. I'll be giving you the name, stats, and design of these Pokemon, and all you need to do is invent a time machine and deliver them to 2013 Game Freak. So really, you have the easy job here. Anyway, let's start off with a few 3-stage evolution lines, mainly because I'm a sucker for these kind of Pokemon, and it makes my job way easier having to come up with less ideas. Since this region is based on France, I decided to take a look at some animal species native to France that aren't already in the game, and as it turns out, France has pretty much the same animals as the rest of mainland Europe. Like, for example, they got pigs, more specifically, wild boars, which are a little bit cooler. So, I'd like to introduce Saint-Clair. Right, full disclosure, I have no idea how to draw, so you're gonna have to just deal with my horrendous collages that I spent no more than 60 seconds on. This is an electric rock line based on wild boars. I won't go through the names, designs, and stats for every single part of the line, mainly because I realized I'm really bad at coming up with names. But it would start off as a little electric pig, evolve into a slightly bigger electric pig, and then finally reach its final stage, Saint-Clair, who is a really big electric pig with lightning tusks. Its name is based on the French words sanglier, meaning wild boar, and éclair, a delicious French pastry with a cream filling. And also lightning, I guess that makes a little more sense. There are only 3 electric types in Kalos, and at the time, we had yet to see an electric rock type, so this guy should have a clear niche in the Kalos games and in the series as a whole. Most electric types are fast special attackers, so I thought I'd mix things up and make this one more of a slow physical tank. I also would ideally like to make the basic stage of this line available in like the first 2 or 3 routes, so you can get one early and it will grow with you throughout the game. It always annoys me when Game Freak makes like a really cool Pokemon, but you can't actually get one till like the 8th gym when you're basically done with the game already. What's up with that? And on that note, next up is another 3-stage line that you can obtain early on, Cerotice. This is a big frosty bat that is, unsurprisingly, ice and flying. In base Kalos, there are only 2 ice lines, one of which is a fossil that you can lock yourself out of, and the other one isn't available until pretty late into the game. So I figured, let's throw an early one in there to mix things up. As for flying, there are technically a good amount of flying types in Kalos already. I mainly chose to include another because this was the last game with HMs. If you wanted to get around easily in the first 6 generations of Pokemon, a flying type was basically mandatory, which means you're basically using Talonflame every single time. I see this thing as sort of a special version of Crobat. Very fast, hits hard, but not too durable. And maybe it can be like an in-game counterpart to Talonflame. Maybe like you can only find Fletchling during the day and baby Cerotice at night. And by the way, the name is a reference to the Ceratine bat, a species that, isn't exclusive to France or really associated with them in any way, but they got them. The next trio is inspired by perhaps the most famous European legend that, to be fair, is really more associated with England than France, but I am a filthy American, so it's close enough for me. Roy Legend, from the French words Roy, meaning king, and Legend, meaning legend, is a fighting and steel type based on the legend of King Arthur. And I actually thought of a fun gimmick for this one. It starts off as a little, peasant guy with mediocre stats. In its middle stage, it becomes a knight with a new suit of armor, and its defenses go up, but everything else stays about the same. And then for its final stage, it gets a legendary sword and becomes a king, and its attack goes up. Maybe the armor is tied to a side quest with that one castle that was literally empty in the base game, and then you need to like level it up with a hone edge in your party or something like that to get the final one. And as a bonus, everyone gets to point back at this guy 6 years later saying it was a hint for Pokemon Sword and Shield all along, when it was actually just a total coincidence. Feel like y'all do that kind of a lot. Alright, a couple more 3-stage lines to bang out. France is home to a species called the Marbled Newt that I think could make a good poison and water type. Again, because of HMs, including more water types that can learn Surf never hurts. Another animal that is apparently common in France is the Alpine Marmot, a scrappy, burrowing little guy that I think could make a good ground and fighting type. And, get this, it's a marmot that fights, so it's called Marmite. I'm not sorry for that one. Like the rest of the world, France has got a lot of bugs, so I thought it'd be fun to introduce 2 new bug lines that are version exclusive. In X, you'll find the Sarah Beetle line, bug psychic types based around the longhorn beetle, and maybe they use their horns as like antenna to send out psychic signals to communicate with their colony or something like that. And then on the other side, you have Hallibug, based on the stink bug that isn't native to France, but is apparently very invasive. Maybe you can like fold that into this guy's lore. They're like mischievous bug dark little scamps that rolled into town one day and started causing all sorts of problems. Their name comes from Haliomorpha halis, the scientific name for stink bugs, and bug, which is just the French word for bug. I feel like that one was kind of obvious. And I want these guys to be really good. I'm talking monsters. I'm sick of Game Freak churning out all these garbage insects. Please, someone explain to me who Masquerain was for. So that's 7 new 3-stage evolution lines, bringing our total of new Pokemon up to 21. Let's get a couple more in here. Prior to Generation 6, Steel and Poison weren't the best offensive types. Most Steel types were built around defense rather than attack, and Poison was literally only super effective against grass, along with half the other types in the game, it feels like. But with the introduction of Fairy, you suddenly have a much better reason to get a Poison or Steel type on your team. But if you only want to use new Kalos Pokemon, you don't have a whole lot of options. So let's add Asplate in there, a 2-stage Steel and Poison type line inspired by the Asp Viper, but with like steel plates and stuff. I don't know. You know what I miss? Secret fossil Pokemon. In Generation 1, you had Kabuto and Ammonite, but then you also could find the super cool Aerodactyl. So let's throw another 1-stage fossil Pokemon in here inspired by the Dacentroris. Took me forever to get that name right. Basically just a slightly bigger Stegosaurus that was first discovered in France. Maybe it's a rock and fighting type, that's pretty rare, and it's got a big axe on its tail instead of spikes, so you can call it Dacentroris. I've always really liked the idea of Pokemon with connected lore. Something like Heatmor and Durant. Durant was just a bug who developed steel armor to defend itself from predators, so Heatmor turned into a fire type to be able to melt through that armor. So I thought I'd do a similar thing with 2 more animals that are common to France, basically everywhere else too, sheep and bears. Look, France, I don't know what to tell you. Get some more unique animals. Bears are omnivorous, meaning they eat both plants and animals. So, say we had a normal type bear Pokemon. If you want to get all Darwinian up in here, maybe it was Ursaring. And their main source of food was a little grassy sheep who, instead of wool, has a big bush with berries for a body. Plants and animals all in one. The Ursaring were treating these things like an all-you-can-eat buffet, so eventually they evolved Darwin style into worms. We're going with worms, which is a grass and electric type that obtained the static ability. Being a physical attacker, ancient Ursaring would have had to make physical contact to damage them, which would cause them to become paralyzed, allowing worms to get away. So, in response, Ursaring slowly evolved Darwin style to become more resistant to electricity, eventually becoming a new species entirely. And finally, I noticed that Dark was still a little lacking, and even though there are a gajillion fairy types in the game, one of them is Aromatisse, which, as I proved a few weeks ago, statistically doesn't count. So I threw in one last 2-stage line with Staglow, a dark and fairy type deer with glow-in-the-dark antlers, also known as If Stantler Didn't Suck. The name comes from stag and glow, by the way. I don't know how to spell that one out. That brings our dex up to 128, including megas, but I wanted to round things out with a few new legendary Pokemon. X and Y actually only had 3 legendary Pokemon available in the main game, unlike most previous generations, which had some lower tier legends that you could also hunt down. The current legends in X and Y represent life, death, and the balance between the two. So for this sub-trio, I thought it'd be cool if their lore is that they facilitate the order that Zygarde enforces, sort of like his henchmen, representing the transition from life to death. I looked for cool French mythological inspirations for this idea and couldn't really find any, so we're heading a little bit north for this one. Like I said, filthy American. The main legends are based on Norse mythology anyway, so I think it's fine. In Irish mythology, there is a trio of goddesses referred to as the Morrigan. Sometimes they're 3 separate entities, sometimes they're one thing, but we're gonna roll with it. The Morrigan is associated with war, fate, and destiny. All things that seem to fit with the idea of moving between life and death and Kalos' history of war. It also often takes the form of a raven or a flock of ravens, so maybe these could all be designed around birds, sort of an homage to the OG bird trio that they just threw in here for some reason. First, we have Matcha, a grass and fire type that's sort of a phoenix coming out of an egg, representing birth and rebirth, the start of life. I didn't make up any of these names, by the way. They're just the actual names of the Irish goddesses. I have no idea what they mean or if they're relevant at all. I just got lazy. Next, we have Bobbed, probably not how it's pronounced. That is a poison and ice type that is themed around the idea of dying. Poison for disease, ice for frost and harsh winters, all things that would have been a problem for the early inhabitants of Kalos. This one could be like a big skeletal bird with purple clouds of smog for wings and snow falling wherever it flies, leaving death and devastation in its wake. But other than that, it's a pretty chill dude. And finally, we have Anand, a fairy and ground type that's themed around mushrooms and fungus. The earth reclaiming the dead and returning their nutrients to the soil to eventually feed new life. So Xerneas and Yveltal represent the states of life and death, and these guys are the cogs that facilitate that cycle. So there you have it. With those new Pokemon, that brings our new total up to 103 Kalos Pokemon, about on par with Johto and Sinnoh, or 131 if you choose to include the new Megas. And these are the updated totals for each type. See, Game Freak? You can absolutely get away with being lazy. Just do a little bit of math. But I gotta say, all this talk of Pokemon X and Y has got me real nostalgic for the glory days of 2013, When everyone was super psyched the world didn't end, we were all wondering what the Fox said and lamenting about the death of the MCU and laughing at this funny dog meme that definitely wouldn't grow into a crazy crypto scam. And a massive thank you to all my supporters on Patreon, including Alakazam, Aspa102, Big Dog Tie 4 to Win, Captain Kirby, Sidian, Sherry and Mark, Stylish, The Boss Killer 94, Tricks of Crows, and did you know that the character limit on the Patreon name is very high? Well, it is high enough, in fact, that I could name myself M. Thanks, M.